There is a book that reads like an act of reckoning, the kind only possible when someone has been inside a system of belief, lived it, and then walked out the other side. Karl Marx as a religious type, first published in Russian in 1906 and later translated into English in 1979, is that reckoning made literature. Its author, Sergei Bulgakov, was no armchair critic. He had been a serious Marxist, had studied Marx in Germany, had met the great socialist theoreticians of his age face to face. And then, over years of honest intellectual struggle, he turned away, not toward cynicism, but toward God, eventually becoming one of the most formidable Russian Orthodox theologians of the 20th century. This is a summary of that extraordinary work. His diagnosis of Karl Marx not as a social scientist, not as an economist, not even primarily as a revolutionary thinker, but as a man animated by something older and darker than any theory, a religious passion wearing the costume of science. The book is short, just over 100 pages, but dense in the way that only essays born from genuine personal knowledge can be. Bulgakov is not hostile in a cheap way. He takes Marx seriously enough to look through the arguments to the man behind them, and what he finds there is something Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, who praised this work, called one of the deepest analyses of the heart of Marxism ever written. What you are about to hear is a chapter-by-chapter guide to Bulgakov's argument, taught with the conviction that Bulgakov himself, with all his unusual authority, intended it. Chapter 1. The source of the religious nature of modern socialism. The question Bulgakov raises at the outset is not the one most people expect. He does not begin by asking whether Marx was wrong about economics. He begins by asking what kind of human phenomenon socialism actually is, what fire is burning inside it. His answer is immediate and arresting. Socialism, for all its professed materialism, is not a scientific theory in the way it presents itself. It is a religion. Not a religion with a god, or rather not one it will admit to, but a religion in the structural sense, the psychological sense, the moral sense. It offers a complete account of history, a diagnosis of evil, a vision of redemption, a chosen people, an enemy, an eschatology, and a this worldly promise of salvation. This matters, Bulgakov argues, because you cannot understand what Marxism does to people, what it inspires, what ferocity it produces, what sacrifices its adherents are willing to make, if you look at it only as a set of propositions about capital and labor. Men do not give their lives for propositions. They give their lives for faiths. And Marxism, structurally, functions as a faith, one that has taken the energy that in other ages poured into theology and baptized it in secular language, claiming scientific authority while operating as revelation. The implication is serious. If socialism is a religious phenomenon wearing scientific clothes, then arguing with it on purely economic grounds is like arguing with a church by pointing out problems in the parish accounts. You are addressing the wrong level of the thing. What is at work in the Marxist movement is not, at its root, an error in reasoning about surplus value. What is at work is a soul, a particular type of soul, and that soul requires a different kind of examination. Bulgakov is going to conduct that examination. Chapter 2. The character and personality of Karl Marx. Bulgakov turns to the man himself, and from the opening lines of this chapter, a portrait emerges that is entirely unlike the reverent icon socialism would prefer. The Marx Bulgakov draws is neither saint nor monster. He is something more interesting. A human being whose personality illuminates his philosophy more honestly than the philosophy ever illuminated itself. What Bulgakov observes is a man of extraordinary intellectual power, paired with an extraordinary incapacity for warmth toward actual human beings. Marx's writings are full of passionate concern for humanity in the abstract, for the proletariat as a class, for the suffering masses across historical time. But his relations with concrete persons are, again and again, marked by contempt, condescension, and a need for domination. He was not generous with rivals. He destroyed Ferdinand Lassalle with mockery. He used and discarded collaborators. Even his long friendship with Engels was colored by a relentless financial dependence that Marx felt no apparent shame about, drawing upon Engels's resources while maintaining the posture of a sovereign intellect who owed the world nothing. Bulgakov does not present this as simple personal failing. He is a careful enough thinker to know that character analysis is not the same as refutation. But he insists that character illuminates motivation, and motivation illuminates the real engine driving a body of ideas. A man who loves humanity in the abstract while holding individual humans in contempt is not an unusual type. He is, in fact, a recognizable religious type, the kind of personality that appears throughout the history of fanatical movements. The abstraction becomes the idol. The idol demands the sacrifice of the actual. Chapter 3. Marx and Human Personhood. Here, Bulgakov advances to what he considers the philosophic heart of his critique. The problem with Marx's view of the human person is not simply that it is materialist. Bulgakov is sophisticated enough to know that materialism comes in many forms. The problem is that Marx dissolves the individual person into an economic category. The person, in Marx's system, is not a bearer of unique dignity, not an image of anything transcendent, not a moral subject with irreducible inner life. The person is a product of his relations of production. Change the economic structure and you change the man, as predictably as you would change the output of a machine by changing its inputs. Bulgakov shows that this is not a conclusion Marx arrives at reluctantly after examining the evidence. It is a prior commitment, a metaphysical wager placed long before Capital was written. And it is a wager that makes genuine ethics impossible because ethics requires that the individual person be treated as an end in himself and not merely as a function of historical forces. If persons are simply nodes in an economic structure, then you cannot wrong a person. You can only misread the structure. The revolutionary who destroys lives in the name of liberating the proletariat is not committing a moral crime. He is simply accelerating history. What is lost in this picture is something that every serious tradition of moral philosophy, and certainly every serious religious tradition, has insisted upon: the irreducibility of the human person, the fact that each man and woman carries something that cannot be reduced to their social position or their function in production. Strip that away, and you have not liberated humanity. You have abolished it at the level of thought before you can even begin to reshape it at the level of politics. Chapter 4. Marx and Non-Individuality. This chapter extends the previous one into the sociological dimension. Bulgakov examines how Marx's treatment of individuality, or rather his effective elimination of it, shapes his entire social vision. In Marx's system, the unit of analysis is always the class, never the person. History is made by classes in conflict, not by individual human beings exercising moral agency. The individual who appears to make history, the revolutionary leader, the great capitalist, the reformer, is, for Marx, simply the instrument through which deeper impersonal forces express themselves. Bulgakov finds this account not just philosophically inadequate, but personally revealing. There is something in the thoroughness with which Marx erases the individual from his theory that mirrors the contempt for individuals in his practice. A thinker who genuinely believed that persons matter, who carried within himself any real sensitivity to the concrete dignity of a particular human face, could not so cleanly dissolve individuality into category. The intellectual move and the personal disposition are of a piece. There is also something here about collectivism as a spiritual danger rather than merely a political error. When you organize a vision of society around the group, whether the class, the race, the nation, or any other collective, you have created a structure in which the individual can always be sacrificed for the abstraction. The abstraction becomes sacred, the sacrifice becomes righteous. Bulgakov is watching this logic develop at the level of theory, and he knows, writing in 1906, where such logic leads. Chapter 5. Marx and the Religious Spirit. Having established the philosophical framework, Bulgakov now turns to what he considers the most revealing dimension of his subject: Marx's own relationship to religion, the religion he rejected and the religion he, unknowingly, became. The chapter is dense with insight about the psychology of atheism as a negative theology, the way in which the fierceness of a man's opposition to God can itself reveal the shape of his original religious hunger. Marx did not merely disbelieve in God in the quiet way of a man who has thought the matter over and finds the arguments unpersuasive. Marx hated God. Or rather, he hated the idea of God with an intensity that Bulgakov reads as deeply meaningful. One of Marx's favorite quotations, taken from the Greek playwright Aeschylus, was the line of Prometheus, "I hate all gods. This is not skepticism, this is a rival passion." The man who is simply indifferent to God does not quote Prometheus with relish. What Bulgakov discerns in Marx is the structure of a theological soul turned inside out. The categories are all present: evil, redemption, history as drama moving toward an end, a righteous suffering people, a corrupt oppressing class, a final transformation that will make all things new. Stripped of transcendence, these categories become ideology. The proletariat becomes the suffering servant. The revolution becomes the apocalypse. The classless society becomes paradise. You can rename every element of the Christian eschatological narrative and place it inside Marx's historical materialism, and the structure holds. That is not coincidence. That is the shape of a soul that could not stop being religious even while it declared war on religion. Chapter 6. Marx's General Philosophical Ideology. Bulgakov steps back here and surveys Marx's philosophical positions as a whole, showing how each piece fits together and how the ensemble reveals the same underlying temperament. Marx began as a young Hegelian, absorbing Hegel's grand schema of history as the dialectical unfolding of spirit, and then, along with Feuerbach, though more radically, turned that schema upside down. Where Hegel had spirit moving through matter, Marx had matter moving through itself, producing consciousness as a byproduct. Where Hegel had history moving toward the self-realization of the absolute, Marx had history moving toward the self-realization of man. This inversion is philosophically significant, but Bulgakov's point is that it preserved the form while changing the content. The dialectic, the sense of history as meaningful and moving toward a destination, the belief that there is a logic running through events that the initiated can perceive and align themselves with. All of this comes directly from Hegel, and behind Hegel from the theological tradition that Hegel himself was secularizing. Marx did not break with that tradition. He completed a particular line of its secularization. What Marx added, and this is Bulgakov's sharpest observation in this chapter, was the moralizing intensity. Hegel wrote like a philosopher detached from the drama he was describing. Marx wrote like a prophet. His Capital is not simply an economic analysis, it is a document of moral outrage, and the categories, exploitation, alienation, surplus value extracted by force, are moral categories dressed in the clothes of science. The fury in Marx's prose is not the fury of a scientist who has found an error in the data. It is the fury of a man who has found an abomination and cannot abide it. Chapter 7. Marx, Feuerbach, and the Religious Question. This is the philosophical center of the book. Ludwig Feuerbach was the thinker who most directly shaped Marx's attitude toward religion, and Bulgakov devotes this long chapter to tracing exactly what that influence was, how Marx absorbed it, and where he diverged from it in ways that reveal his distinctive religious psychology. Feuerbach's argument, in brief, was that God is a projection of human nature, that the divine attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect love are simply human capacities alienated from their true subject and projected onto an imaginary being in the sky. Religion, for Feuerbach, was humanity's failure to recognize itself. The task of philosophy was to reclaim those projected attributes, to bring God back to earth as man, to recognize that the true content of religion is the human species itself. Feuerbach called this anthropotheism, the religion of man as God. Marx took this framework and radicalized it. Where Feuerbach saw the problem as philosophical, a cognitive error about where the divine attributes truly reside, Marx saw it as economic. The reason humanity alienates its powers into an imaginary God, Marx argued, is that real human beings in real economic conditions are actually alienated from their own labor, their own creative powers, their own species being. Fix the economic conditions and the religious alienation will disappear naturally. Religion is not the problem. It is the symptom. The problem is capitalism. Bulgakov's commentary here is exquisite. He shows that Marx, in making this move, was not escaping the religious framework Feuerbach had created. He was inhabiting it more completely. If the true content of religion is humanity itself, if man is the true God, then the Marxist project of liberating humanity from alienation is not irreligious. It is the most serious religion imaginable, the one that places the full weight of salvation history on human shoulders, that tasks man with redeeming himself by his own revolutionary action. The classless society in this framework is not an economic arrangement. It is paradise regained, by man alone, without God, through violence if necessary. This is the inversion at the center of everything, and Bulgakov, who had traveled through Marxism and out the other side, understands exactly what such an inversion costs. When man becomes God, what becomes of the man who stands in the way of the divine project? Chapter 8. Marx and the Jewish Question. This chapter addresses one of the most uncomfortable corners of Marx's legacy, his early essay on the Jewish Question, a document that has troubled his admirers for a century and a half. Bulgakov approaches it without evasion. In that essay, the young Marx, himself of Jewish ancestry, delivered an analysis of Judaism that was, by any fair reading, deeply hostile. He associated Judaism not with a religious or ethnic identity, but with the spirit of commerce, huckstering, and money worship. The emancipation of society from capitalism was, in Marx's framework, simultaneously emancipation from the Jewish spirit. Bulgakov is careful not to turn this into simple denunciation. He is interested in what the essay reveals about Marx's own psychology, a man fleeing his origins, recasting the particular suffering of his own people into an abstract category and directing what might have been personal anguish outward as theoretical rage. The essay is not incidentally anti-Semitic in the way that a casual prejudice might produce. It has the structure of a man working something out, and what he is working out involves his own relationship to a history he has inherited but refuses to inhabit. There is also a broader observation here about what happens when a religious tradition is reduced to its economic caricature. Judaism, as Bulgakov understands it, is one of the great streams of the human encounter with the living God. To collapse that into the spirit of money is not merely unfair, it is a kind of spiritual violence, the violence of abstraction against the concrete, of theory against life. Marx performs this violence against his own heritage, which is perhaps the most revealing thing about the procedure itself. Chapter 9. Marx, Anti-Semitism and Atheism. Bulgakov develops the previous chapter's themes by placing Marx's hostility toward Judaism within his broader hostility toward religion itself. He argues that Marx's atheism and his anti-Jewish sentiment in the early essay are related phenomena, both expressions of the same underlying drive to sever the connections between humanity and the transcendent, between people and their particular traditions, between the lived inheritance of the past and the revolutionary project of the future. There is something paradoxical at the center of this observation, and Bulgakov does not miss it. Marx, who despised religion as the opium of the people, was himself operating within a structure of belief that performed every function religion performs, except the one that matters most. It offered a community of the faithful, a moral framework, a reading of history, a hope for the future. What it did not offer was any actual opening onto the transcendent, any encounter with a reality beyond the human, any ground of value that was not itself a product of human will or historical force. This is what makes Marxist atheism, in Bulgakov's reading, spiritually more dangerous than ordinary unbelief. The man who simply stops attending church and lives a quiet secular life has, in some sense, left the religious question open. He has simply set it aside. But the man who redirects the full force of religious passion toward an immanent earthly project has not left the question open. He has answered it with a counterfeit. And counterfeits are more dangerous than absences, because they satisfy the appetite while poisoning the one who feeds on them. Chapter 10. Marx's Feuerbachianism. In this penultimate analytical chapter, Bulgakov pulls together the threads of his argument about the relationship between Marx and Feuerbach, showing that Marx was, at a deep level, a Feuerbachian who would not admit it, and that his failure to admit it was philosophically consequential. Feuerbach's anthropotheism, his religion of humanity, was, in its own way, an honest position. Feuerbach said openly, "God is man, man is God," and the task of enlightened humanity is to recognize and celebrate this. There was a kind of naive warmth in Feuerbach, a genuine love of the human that made his atheism almost sentimental. Marx scorned him for this softness. The point Marx famously declared in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach was not to interpret the world, but to change it. But here is Bulgakov's insight. In rejecting Feuerbach's sentimental humanism and replacing it with revolutionary violence, Marx did not escape Feuerbach's framework. He completed it in its most radical form. If man is God, then the stakes of human history are literally infinite. Because when God acts, everything is permitted that serves the divine purpose. The revolution becomes a holy war. The enemy of the revolution becomes the enemy of God. The suffering inflicted on those who stand in the path of liberation is not murder. It is sacrifice on the altar of history. Feuerbach, for all his errors, retained enough of the humanist tradition to find this implication repellent. Marx, by stripping away the sentimentality and installing the dialectic in its place, produced a system in which the implication becomes not only visible but necessary. This, Bulgakov argues, is the line that runs from Marx's philosophy to the firing squads of the revolution that Bulgakov himself would live to see. Chapter 11. Marx's peculiar imprint on socialism. The final chapter steps back from the philosophical analysis to ask what Marx specifically added to the socialist tradition. What is distinctively Marxist about Marxism, as opposed to the broader river of socialist thought that existed before and alongside him? Bulgakov's answer is precise. What Marx gave socialism was not its moral passion, which was already present, and not its utopianism, which was already present, but its scientific pretension combined with its apocalyptic certainty. Before Marx, socialists were often dreamers, cooperative communities, utopian schemes, visions of brotherhood that were frankly idealistic. They could be argued with on the grounds that they were impractical. Marx changed the terms of the argument entirely by claiming that socialism was not a moral preference, but a scientific prediction. Capitalism would collapse of its own internal contradictions. The proletariat would inevitably triumph. History was on the side of the revolution. This gave the movement a quality it had not previously possessed, the invulnerability of the inevitable. And it is here that the religious structure becomes most visible. The true believer who is fighting on the side of historical necessity fights with a fervor that mere preference could never produce. He is not arguing for a policy. He is participating in the fulfillment of destiny. His opponents are not simply wrong. They are on the wrong side of history, which in Marxist terms means they are opposing the movement of the real, opposing the divine, opposing the final liberation of humanity. The category of heresy, expelled through the front door of atheism, slips back in through the window of scientific determinism. Bulgakov closes by observing that the peculiar genius and peculiar danger of Marx was precisely this combination: the moral heat of a prophet with the claimed authority of a scientist. Neither alone would have been sufficient. Together, they produced one of the most powerful and destructive intellectual movements in human history, a movement that, by the time this translation was published in 1979, had already produced a century of blood in the name of the paradise it promised. Closing, what Bulgakov ultimately hands us is something rarer than critique. It is understanding. He understood Marxism from the inside because he had lived inside it, had believed it with the seriousness it demands, and had then followed his intellectual honesty wherever it led, which was, in the end, toward the God whom Marx had declared war on. That journey gives this book an authority that no merely external analysis could possess. The man who shows you the mechanism of a trap is most convincing when he himself was once caught in it. Seen whole, Karl Marx as a religious type establishes something that our age, which still produces new variants of the same fundamental structure, needs to hear with fresh ears: the danger of any movement that absolutizes a human project, that locates the salvation of the world in a political program, that transfers the energy of genuine religious longing into an imminent cause. Such movements do not liberate the religious impulse. They enslave it, and through it enslave the people who fall under their spell. The human person is made for something that no economic arrangement can provide. Bulgakov knew this because he had been to the other place and come back, read his diagnosis carefully, and then read the full book. Solzhenitsyn was right. Nothing else has gone quite so deep.